In the summer of 1940, Nazi Germany controlled almost all of Western Europe. France had surrendered. Poland was gone. Norway, Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, all occupied. The Wehrmacht had crushed everything in its path, and now Adolf Hitler turned his attention across the English Channel toward the last country still standing, Britain. To invade, he needed one thing: control of the sky, and standing between the Luftwaffe and total air supremacy over southern England was a single-seat fighter plane with an elliptical wing, a Rolls-Royce engine, and a top speed that could match anything the Germans had. The Supermarine Spitfire. That was July 1940. By September, either the Spitfire and the pilots who flew it would break the Luftwaffe's grip, or Britain would face invasion. There was no backup plan. There was no second chance. So how did a small British aircraft company build the plane that saved a nation? And why did the man who designed it never live to see it fly in combat? If you had asked anyone in the British aviation industry about Reginald Joseph Mitchell back in 1920, they would have told you he was a sharp young designer at the Supermarine Aviation Works in Southampton. Talented, sure. But nobody was predicting he would build the most important fighter plane of the 20th century. They had no idea. Mitchell had started as an apprentice at a locomotive engineering firm in Stoke-on-Trent when he was 16 years old. He studied engineering and mathematics at night school, and by 1920, at just 25, he had become the chief designer at Supermarine. 25. Most engineers at that level were twice his age, which, looking back, was either incredibly confident hiring or an act of pure instinct by the company. Either way, it paid off. Supermarine built seaplanes, flying boats and racing aircraft, specifically. And through the 1920s, Mitchell designed a series of racing seaplanes for the Schneider Trophy, an international competition that pushed the boundaries of speed and aerodynamic design. His Supermarine S6B won the trophy outright in 1931, setting a world speed record of over 400 miles per hour. That is an astonishing number for 1931. Most cars on British roads were doing maybe 40. But the Schneider Trophy was more than a prize. It was Mitchell's laboratory. Every race taught him something about streamlining, about how air flows over curved surfaces, about the relationship between engine power and airframe efficiency. The lessons he learned building racing seaplanes in the late 20s and early 30s would directly shape the fighter plane that saved Britain a decade later. He just did not know it yet. Everything was in place. Mitchell just did not know what everything was building toward. In 1933, Mitchell received a diagnosis that would have stopped most people cold: colorectal cancer. He underwent surgery, and doctors told him the prognosis was not good. He was 38 years old, with a young family, and a career that was just hitting its stride. The sensible thing would have been to slow down, to rest, to step away from the drafting table. Mitchell did the opposite. He went back to work with an intensity that alarmed the people around him, almost as if he understood that the clock was ticking and he needed to finish something important before it ran out. Around this same time, the British Air Ministry had issued a specification calling for a new single-seat fighter to replace the aging biplanes that made up the RAF's front line. Mitchell submitted a design. It was rejected. Too conventional, too slow. The Air Ministry wanted something faster, something more modern, something that could handle the new generation of bombers that Germany was quietly building under Hitler's rearmament program. So Mitchell went back to the drawing board. And this is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. Instead of tweaking his rejected design, he threw it away entirely and started from scratch. He pulled everything he had learned from the Schneider Trophy races, combined it with the latest advances in metal construction and retractable landing gear, and began sketching something that looked completely unlike anything the RAF had ever flown. The wing was the breakthrough. Mitchell designed an elliptical wing, thin and elegant, that distributed lift more evenly across its entire span than a conventional straight or tapered wing. This shape reduced drag, which meant more speed. It also gave the wing enough internal volume to house the guns and ammunition without bulging the surface. 8 Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing. That was an extraordinary amount of firepower for a single-seat fighter in the mid-1930s, and Mitchell made it all fit inside that beautiful curved wing without sacrificing an ounce of aerodynamic performance. Then came the engine. Rolls-Royce had been developing a new liquid-cooled V12 engine called the Merlin. It produced around 1,000 horsepower in its early versions, and it would eventually be developed to produce nearly 2,000. Mitchell mated his airframe to this engine, and the combination was something special. The prototype, designated Type 300, first flew on March 5, 1936, from Eastleigh Aerodrome near Southampton. The test pilot was a man named Joseph Mutt Summers, and after landing from that maiden flight, he reportedly told the ground crew not to touch anything. The aircraft flew beautifully. The name Spitfire was suggested by the chairman of Vickers, which owned Supermarine at the time. Mitchell himself reportedly disliked it. He called it the sort of silly name they would give it. But the name stuck, and history proved the chairman right. It was a name people could rally behind. The Air Ministry was convinced. They ordered 310 Spitfires straight off the production line, an enormous commitment for a plane that had only just made its first flight. Production began at the Supermarine factory in Woolston, Southampton, but the process was painfully slow. The elliptical wing, while aerodynamically brilliant, was difficult and time-consuming to manufacture. Each wing required precise forming of the curved metal skin, careful riveting of the internal structure, and meticulous fitting of the gun bays and ammunition feeds. Skilled workers shaped every panel by hand. The production rate was nowhere near what the RAF needed if war was coming. The government recognized this bottleneck and authorized a massive new factory at Castle Bromwich in Birmingham, specifically dedicated to building Spitfires at scale. But the Castle Bromwich factory was a disaster in its early days. Managed initially by the Morris Motors Car Company, the plant struggled to adapt automotive production techniques to aircraft manufacturing. By the spring of 1940, Castle Bromwich had not delivered a single completed Spitfire, despite months of preparation and millions of pounds invested. It was a crisis. Lord Nuffield, who ran Morris Motors, was pushed aside, and Lord Beaverbrook took control. Under Beaverbrook's relentless pressure, Castle Bromwich finally began delivering aircraft, and by the second half of 1940, it was producing Spitfires faster than any other facility in the country. You would think someone would have sounded the alarm sooner. Nobody did. Mitchell would look back on this moment and wish he had made a different call on certain manufacturing details. But in truth, he was running out of time to make any calls at all. His cancer had returned, more aggressively than before. Through 1936 and into 1937, Mitchell continued working on refinements to the Spitfire, pushing through pain and exhaustion, driven by something that went beyond professional obligation. People who worked with him said he seemed to understand that this aircraft mattered in a way that transcended normal engineering, that it was going to be needed, badly. On June 11, 1937, Reginald Joseph Mitchell died at his home in Southampton. He was 42 years old. The Spitfire had not yet entered squadron service. He never saw a single one painted in RAF camouflage, never watched one take off on a combat mission, never knew that his creation would become the most celebrated fighter aircraft in history. He just built it, and then he was gone. For a while after Mitchell's death, things actually seemed manageable. His colleague Joseph Smith took over as chief designer and continued developing the Spitfire through its early production challenges. The first Spitfires entered service with number 19 Squadron at RAF Duxford in August 1938. Pilots loved them immediately. Compared to the biplanes they had been flying, the Spitfire felt like strapping yourself to a rocket. It was fast, responsive, and it climbed like nothing else in the RAF inventory. But production was still agonizingly slow. By September 1939, when Britain declared war on Germany after the invasion of Poland, the RAF had fewer than 200 Spitfires ready for combat. 200! To defend an entire nation against the largest and most experienced air force in the world. That did not last. The first months of the war, the so-called Funny War, gave Britain a narrow window to ramp up production. Factories worked around the clock. New production lines opened. Women entered the aircraft factories in large numbers for the first time, riveting fuselages and assembling instrument panels alongside the men. Lord Beaverbrook, appointed Minister of Aircraft Production by Winston Churchill in May 1940, drove Spitfire output with a ruthlessness that bordered on mania. He stripped resources from other programs, commandeered factory space, and pushed workers to their limits. He launched an appeal for aluminum, asking housewives across Britain to donate their pots and pans to be melted down and turned into aircraft. The actual usefulness of those donated saucepans to aircraft production was questionable at best, but the psychological effect was real. Every household in Britain felt like they were personally helping to build Spitfires. The numbers began to climb, slowly at first, then faster. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything about what was about to happen. On May 10, 1940, Germany launched its blitzkrieg against France and the Low Countries. The speed of the German advance stunned everyone. Within weeks, the British Expeditionary Force was trapped on the coast at Dunkirk, and a desperate evacuation began across the English Channel. Spitfires flew cover over those beaches, engaging German bombers high above the smoke and chaos below. The soldiers on the sand could not always see the Spitfires fighting miles inland, preventing Luftwaffe aircraft from ever reaching the evacuation fleet. Many evacuees came home angry at the RAF for what they saw as abandonment. They did not realize the Spitfire was doing its job. The very people it was protecting could not tell. It was a bitter irony that would not be fully understood for years. 6 weeks after the blitzkrieg began, France surrendered. Britain was alone. The United States was still neutral. The Soviet Union had a non-aggression pact with Germany. There was no cavalry coming. Hitler ordered his generals to prepare Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain by sea. But the German Navy was not strong enough to cross the Channel if the RAF still controlled the skies above it. The Luftwaffe's commander, Hermann Göring, assured Hitler that his air force could destroy the RAF in a matter of weeks. He was confident, almost dismissive. The Luftwaffe had crushed the Polish and French air forces with ease. Britain would be no different. Göring was wrong. And the reason he was wrong had a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and an elliptical wing. The Battle of Britain began in earnest in July 1940 and intensified through August and September. The Luftwaffe sent wave after wave of bombers and fighters across the Channel, targeting RAF airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories. The goal was simple: destroy the RAF on the ground and in the air until Britain had no fighters left to oppose an invasion fleet. The RAF had 2 primary fighter aircraft to meet this assault: the Hawker Hurricane and the Supermarine Spitfire. The Hurricane actually made up the majority of Fighter Command squadrons, and it shot down more enemy aircraft during the Battle of Britain than any other plane. It deserves enormous credit. But the Spitfire could do something the Hurricane could not. It could fight the Messerschmitt Bf 109 on equal terms. The Bf 109 was Germany's best single-seat fighter, and it was an exceptional aircraft. Fast, well-armed, and flown by experienced pilots, many of whom had been fighting since the Spanish Civil War. Against the Hurricane, the 109 held a clear advantage in speed and climb rate. But against the Spitfire, the matchup was almost perfectly even. The Spitfire had a tighter turning circle. The 109 had a slight edge in dive speed and high-altitude performance. In a dogfight between the two, the outcome often came down to pilot skill and who saw the other one first. This forced the Luftwaffe into a problem they had not anticipated. They could not simply sweep the sky clear of British fighters the way they had done over Poland and France. Every time German bombers appeared over southern England, they were met by Spitfires and Hurricanes that refused to go away. RAF Fighter Command, led by Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, used a system of radar stations and ground observers to track incoming German formations and direct fighter squadrons to intercept them. It was the first integrated air defense system in history, and it worked because the Spitfire and Hurricane could get airborne, climb to altitude, and engage the enemy before the bombers reached their targets. The pilots who flew these missions were astonishingly young. The average age of an RAF fighter pilot during the Battle of Britain was 23, some were 19. They flew multiple sorties a day, scrambling from their dispersal huts at the sound of a bell, sprinting to their Spitfires, and being airborne within minutes. Ground crews worked through the night to patch bullet holes, replace damaged engines, and rearm the guns so that every available aircraft would be ready by dawn. These mechanics and armorers rarely got the recognition they deserved, but without them, the Spitfires would have stayed on the ground. The physical and psychological toll on the pilots was enormous. A typical day during the peak of the battle meant 3, 4, sometimes 5 sorties. Pilots ate breakfast, knowing they might not eat lunch. They slept in their flight gear so they could be airborne faster when the scramble bell rang. Some pilots developed tremors, others could not sleep at all. Burns from cockpit fires were common because the Spitfire's fuel tank sat directly in front of the cockpit, and a hit to that tank turned the entire forward section into a fireball. Many pilots were killed. Those who survived often carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Churchill called them the few, and his words captured something essential about what was happening. Never in the field of human conflict, he told Parliament, was so much owed by so many to so few. And this is the part where things stopped being funny. By late August 1940, the RAF was in serious trouble. The Luftwaffe's attacks on airfields and sector stations were doing real damage. Fighter Command was losing pilots faster than it could replace them. The chain of radar stations along the southern coast had gaps. Several key airfields were badly damaged. If the Luftwaffe had continued targeting Fighter Command's infrastructure for another 2 or 3 weeks, the outcome of the battle might have been very different. Then Goering made his mistake. On September 7th, he shifted the Luftwaffe's attacks away from RAF airfields and toward London. The Blitz had begun. The bombing of London was horrifying for civilians, destroying homes, killing thousands, and setting entire neighborhoods on fire. But for Fighter Command, it was a lifeline. The pressure on the airfields eased, pilots got rest, damaged stations were repaired. New aircraft arrived from the factories. While all of this was playing out in the skies over Kent and Sussex and London, something remarkable was happening on the ground. Ordinary British citizens were raising money to buy Spitfires. The Spitfire Fund, launched by Lord Beaverbrook, invited towns, businesses, schools, and individuals to donate money toward the cost of building new fighter planes. A Spitfire cost about £5,000 in 1940, roughly equivalent to £250,000 today. People gave whatever they could. Factory workers donated a day's wages. School children emptied their piggy banks. Towns held fundraising dances and collection drives. The names of donors and communities were sometimes painted on the sides of the aircraft they helped pay for. It was a national effort, deeply personal, and it connected the civilian population to the air war in a way that nothing else could. The Spitfire was not just the RAF's plane, it belonged to everyone. On September 15, 1940, the Luftwaffe launched its largest daylight attack against London, sending over 1,000 aircraft across the Channel. The RAF responded with everything it had. Spitfires and Hurricanes tore into the German formations over London and southeast England, shooting down 56 aircraft that day alone. The Germans lost more planes than they could sustain, and within days, Hitler quietly postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The invasion of Britain was cancelled. The Battle of Britain was won. If you are finding this valuable, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week, and the next one goes deeper than you would expect. By the autumn of 1940, the immediate threat of invasion had passed. But the Spitfire's war was far from over. If Mitchell's creation had stopped here, this would be a very different story. Instead, the Spitfire went on to fight in nearly every theatre of the Second World War, evolving constantly to meet new challenges. One of the Spitfire's most important and least known roles was photo reconnaissance. Stripped of their guns and armor to save weight, fitted with cameras in their bellies, and painted a pale shade of blue to blend with the sky, reconnaissance. Spitfires flew alone and unarmed over occupied Europe at extreme altitude. Their job was to photograph German military installations, troop movements, and industrial sites. These missions required extraordinary nerve. The pilot had no weapons, no wingman, and no margin for error. If a German fighter spotted them, their only defense was speed. The intelligence these flights gathered was critical to Allied planning throughout the war, and it was the Spitfire's ability to fly higher and faster than anything the Luftwaffe could send after it that made the whole operation possible. In 1942, the island of Malta was under siege. Located in the middle of the Mediterranean, Malta was strategically vital to the Allied war effort because it sat directly across the supply routes between Italy and North Africa. The Axis powers bombed Malta relentlessly, and the island's defenders were desperately short of modern fighter aircraft. Spitfires were shipped to Malta aboard aircraft carriers, launched from the flight deck to fly the final stretch to the island's airfields. It was a risky operation. The planes arrived with limited fuel and often had to land under enemy fire. But once they were on Malta, the Spitfires transformed the island's defense. They gave the RAF and the Royal Navy the air cover they needed to keep Malta's harbors and airfields operational, and Malta held. The supply lines to Rommel's Afrika Korps were disrupted, and the tide of the war in North Africa began to turn. The Spitfire also fought across the deserts of Egypt and Libya, fitted with tropical air filters to keep sand out of the Merlin engine. It served in Italy, in Burma, and in the skies over Normandy on D-Day, June 6, 1944, providing air cover for the Allied invasion fleet as it crossed the Channel. By this point, the Spitfire had evolved through more than 20 distinct marks, each one faster, harder hitting, and more capable than the last. The Merlin engine was eventually replaced in later marks by the Rolls-Royce Griffon, which produced significantly more horsepower and pushed the Spitfire's top speed to over 450 miles per hour. The aircraft that had been designed in the mid-1930s was still competitive against the latest German and Japanese fighters in 1945. I mean, think about that for a second. A design born from a dying man's drawing board lasted the entire war and kept getting better. The Spitfire's adaptability was one of its greatest strengths. It served as a low-altitude interceptor, a high-altitude reconnaissance platform, a naval fighter launched from aircraft carriers, and even a fighter bomber carrying bombs and rockets for ground attack missions. No other Allied fighter performed so many different roles so effectively across so many different environments. The Messerschmitt 109, its great rival, was also developed throughout the war, but it never achieved the same breadth of adaptation. The Spitfire simply had more room to grow, and the engineers who followed Mitchell kept finding new ways to push it further. By the time the war ended in 1945, more than 20,000 Spitfires had been built. They served with the air forces of over a dozen countries, from the Soviet Union to Australia to the United States. American pilots flew Spitfires in North Africa before enough American-built fighters were available. Free French, Polish, Czech, and Norwegian pilots flew Spitfires from British bases, defending the country that had given them shelter after their own homelands fell to occupation. The Polish pilots of 303 Squadron became one of the highest-scoring fighter units during the Battle of Britain, flying Hurricanes initially and later transitioning to Spitfires. Their skill and ferocity in combat were legendary, driven by a personal fury against the nation that had invaded their homeland. For these pilots, every German aircraft they shot down was a small act of revenge and a step toward the liberation of Poland. The Spitfire was their weapon, but the rage was their own. After the war, the Spitfire continued to serve with several air forces into the 1950s, but its days as a frontline fighter were numbered. Jet aircraft were the future, and the era of piston-engined fighters was over. The last operational RAF Spitfire flight took place in 1957, more than 20 years after the prototype's first flight at Eastleigh. But retirement from military service did not mean the end of the Spitfire's story. Today, dozens of Spitfires have been restored to flying condition by collectors, museums, and enthusiasts around the world. The sound of a Merlin engine at an air show still draws crowds by the thousands. There is something about watching a Spitfire fly, its elliptical wings catching the light, its engine producing that distinctive growl that rises to a howl under full power, that reaches people on a level that has nothing to do with technical specifications or combat statistics. It is an emotional response, rooted in what this aircraft represented during the darkest period of the 20th century. Freedom, defiance, survival. Reginald Mitchell never got to hear the cheers. He never stood on an airfield and watched a squadron of Spitfires scramble to meet incoming bombers. He never saw the fund drives in his name, or the children's drawings of his aircraft pinned to classroom walls across Britain. He died believing he had built a good aeroplane. He had no way of knowing he had built the one that would hold the line when everything else crumbled. Mitchell's son, Gordon, later wrote about his father's legacy with a mixture of pride and sadness. The elder Mitchell had been a quiet, private man who worked methodically and avoided the spotlight. He would have been baffled by the mythology that grew around the Spitfire after his death, but he would have understood the engineering. He would have appreciated how Joseph Smith and the team at Supermarine kept developing his design, pushing it further than he ever imagined possible. The Spitfire that fought in 1945 bore Mitchell's DNA, but it had grown into something he never drew. His original vision was strong enough to support 20 years of evolution. That is the mark of exceptional design. The Spitfire remains the most recognized aircraft in British history and arguably the most famous fighter plane ever built. It was not the only plane that won the Battle of Britain. The Hurricane deserves equal recognition, and the entire system of radar, ground control, and coordinated defense that Dowding built was just as important as any single aircraft. But the Spitfire captured something in the national imagination that went beyond military effectiveness. It was beautiful, it was fast, it was British, and it arrived at precisely the moment when Britain needed to believe that it could build something capable of standing against the most formidable military machine the world had ever seen. What survived long after the last Spitfire was retired from service was not just the aircraft itself, but the idea behind it. That one person's work, done under impossible conditions, in a race against their own mortality, could produce something that changes the course of history. Mitchell built the Spitfire, knowing he might not live to see it finished. He built it anyway. And because he did, an island nation of 48 million people did not fall. The factories kept running. The ships kept sailing. The resistance movements across occupied Europe kept receiving supplies and support from a Britain that refused to surrender. Every Spitfire that flies today is a reminder of that. The growl of the Merlin engine over a summer airfield is not just a sound. It is the echo of a moment when the world's future hung in the balance, and a single aircraft, born from a dying man's brilliance, helped tip it towards survival. If this story stayed with you, drop a like, leave a comment telling us which wartime aircraft you think deserves its own documentary, and subscribe so you do not miss the next one.